A very good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I'm Arnold Segawa. Tonight, migrants and the African diaspora. Now, ask any economist worth their salt what the keys are to turn Africa into an economic powerhouse, and they will say it's all about integration of the African economy. And yet, especially in South Africa, xenophobia, among other factors, are undermining this economic goal. Later in our panel discussion, we will discuss why allowing greater freedom of movement across the continent frontiers by African migrants will strengthen economies. But first, the billions of dollars remitted annually by the African diaspora to support families and loved ones back home is standard practice. Not so standard is the diaspora crowdfunding to repair or replace neglected infrastructure back in the home country. Zimbabwe's Diaspora Infrastructure Development Group is doing exactly that, and some of those involved in the fascinating enterprise join me now in the studio in Johannesburg. We do have the Chief Financial Officer, Washington Mashanda, as well as the group's Executive Chairman, Donovan Chimhandamba, in Washington, D.C. We also welcome one of the group's investors, Peter Mataruse, and in London, another investor, Ben Muhaso. Gentlemen, many thanks for squeezing in time to speak to us. A very, very busy endeavor, I can imagine. Donovan, let me start with you. Tell me what inspired this particular move.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I think, we saw an opportunity in 2016. That was number one. And the opportunity was that at that time, Zimbabwe was going through a very painful process or period. And it was very clear that Zimbabwe needs to reach out to a certain different type of investor to drive investments into Zimbabwe. At the very same time, we also coalesced as a group of diasporans in South Africa, through our social golf communities called Brawlers Golf Society. And we sat around the table and we were trying to figure out how do we actually, participate in rebuilding the Zimbabwe's economy. Right. So those two things, I think, put together are some of the things that made us look into Zimbabwe. I mean, it's not a socialist movement. It's purely looking at what makes economic sense in the region, and we believe Zimbabwe is the next frontier for the next 10 years. Washington,
let me come to you. You're the money man. Tell me, how much money have we raised?
Well, the first project that we're working on, is within the $400 million for the recapitalization of the national railways of Zimbabwe.
Peter, when it comes to how to choose which country to go into, away from the fact that you are from Zimbabwe originally, how do you arrive at this particular decision?
Zimbabwe poses very interesting challenges right now, but it also gives a lot of opportunities to Zimbabweans in the diaspora who are used to sending money back home to support their families.
Before we came on, I was making it clear, some countries have tried to do this, at least private citizens, and when they do, governments do critique them for doing this to gain political popularity. What do you say to this, and how do you address it?
Well, in our case, in 2016, I mean, in June 2016 to be specific, the government of Zimbabwe enacted a bill which is called the Zimbabwe National Diaspora. And what propelled that bill or act was driven by the realization that most of their FDI was coming from, or the largest investor in Zimbabwe was the diaspora community. I mean, to give you numbers as an example, in 2016, FDI was about $315 million. But the diaspora remittances through the official channels were about $1.4 billion. And unofficially through, people doing cross-settlements of bills, people carrying money physically over the border, it's estimated that there was about another $3 billion that was not accounted for how it arrived in Zimbabwe. Now, if you're a Zimbabwean government, when you look at that, I think what they quickly did was that, how do we actually speak or mobilize the diaspora? So they actually went ahead and put together a diaspora policy which incentivizes us to bring back our capital.
Washington, let me bring you into the picture again. This is quite interesting, but from a CFO perspective, are there some incentives that have been put forward? It's one thing for the government to say one thing, but are there tax breaks per se if you're bringing money back into the country for an investment of this sort, as a Zimbabwean, of course? Are there incentives that are coming from the government to buoy this particular move?
Yes, indeed. I think when you look at the project, for instance, if I look at specifically the National Railways of Zimbabwe project we're working on, it has been granted what they term a national project status. Now, what national project status means is actually that you enjoy a whole string of benefits, and included in those, obviously, is the tax breaks, you know, reduced duties and rebates on fuel, as well as additional incentives that you may actually require to make your project viable. Because when you look at the railways, it's less about making the money, but more also of a national importance. You've got to get, if the railway network works in your country, that means your cost of doing business is going to go down. So the government has put forward those, and they've even stated in our engagements that you can as well request for additional ones that you feel would make your project viable.
Peter, over to you. Do you as an investor have a guarantee per se that whatever you've bumped in is bound to be realized in the near to midterm?
I think as an investor, my look at it is that I'm investing in the business. I trust the business model that the guys have put together. But like any investment, there's an inherent risk within it. But I trust the business model that Donovan and Washington have put together, and we've come together as other Zimbabweans in the diaspora to say it's time to rebuild our home. We cannot stand by anymore and look at things deteriorating. But we are not charity investors at the end of the day. We want our returns, and we'll still hold Donovan and Washington accountable for the returns that we've put in.
I like the sound of that. You have to hold these guys accountable at the end of it all. Ben, what would make for a good return on investment on your end? And Peter, I want you to answer this too after. But Ben, you go first.
So for me, I'm expecting the double-digit returns, and I think it's important to make it clear that I'm not looking for short-term gains. This is a long-term play. If you look at the growth that, for example, the NRZ has already realized 100 billion of extra revenue in the first quarter due to the interim solution that DIDG has put in. And then you compare it in terms of once DIDG rolls out the full implementation, we are looking at a lot more in terms of the returns. If you look at London, I would be expecting anything below, 5% as a very good return. But in terms of the investment that we've made in Zimbabwe, anything above 10%, which is very achievable from my understanding, is pretty good.
Donovan, you're the group chief. Tell me, when it comes to returns, what would you be actually looking at to put at the table?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think you need to understand our strategy first and foremost. In terms of our strategy, I mean, what we've decided to do is we want to almost facilitate semi-privatization or privatization of economic parastatals running the economic infrastructure. So, because it's like, at a personal level, when you go broke, you're likely to sell some assets to receive some cash. And we expect the Zimbabwean government to also go through some restructuring or reform process that will avail some of these assets. Now, the railway project is one of them. But our real strategy there is that if we control what we call the command in height, then you are able to dictate the pace and control the value chain around the command in height. By that, what we mean is for NRZ to work at its highest levels of efficiency, it needs the value chains or the critical companies that supply into that working.
Guys, very briefly, we're really running out of time. What do you think of the new government? It says it is open for business. Washington and Donovan, just give me your sense of this.
Look, I think the new cabinet sent some very hopeful message. I think they just started. We've got to give them some time. There are people in that government or in that cabinet who definitely have credentials that inspire us. So we're looking forward to the future, and ours is to continue focus on our target.
Washington?
Well, I think as Don has said, I think there is some confidence that is starting to ooze. I mean, I can see even the sort of comments that you're getting about the new finance minister. And I think personally, when I look at it, I believe we need to go in a certain direction. There's bold decisions that have to be made, and we certainly hope that the politicians will take some of those. They may not necessarily be popular decisions that have to be taken, but they are necessary for us to get the country back on the right trajectory.
Washington, Donovan, Peter and Ben, many thanks for making time to speak to us. That is all we had for this time. Coming up after the break, we discuss why at all people are allowing greater mobility of intra-African migrants and how it can actually boost economies, or are they allowing it at all? After the break. Welcome back to Capital Connection with me, Arnold Segawa. Now joining us to discuss xenophobia and why the easing of visa entry requirements for African migrants would spur growth on the continent is economic diplomacy researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Asmita Parshotam, and Anele Ndlovu, who is the president of the Zimbabwe-South Africa Forum. Lady and the gentleman, many thanks for making time to speak to us. Anele, let me just start with you. Zimbabweans in South Africa, huge conglomerate in fact, of course, also has invested in South Africa very, very greatly over the decades. Just give me a sense of what your prescription here would be to make sure that more porousness is seen across the border.
Look, basically, I think the most important thing for the migrants, or the economic migrants, if we may put it that way, is for this easing of the visa issue. Zimbabweans don't have that issue anymore because now they can come in and out of the country. But it's also an issue of economics, really, to say how can Zimbabwe and South Africans work together to empower each other and share the wealth within those two countries. I don't think it should be an issue that is looked at from a one-sided point of view to say they are in South Africa and so on and so forth, but it should be an issue of saying, okay, fine, they are here, and how can we work together going forward? How can we legalize everybody? How can we get everybody working and contributing towards the economy of the country?
Asmita, let me bring you in here. Lots of talk oftentimes about regional economic blocks, of course, SADC being one of these, from a free trade area, customs union, common market, labor mobility. On paper, it's there, but when it comes to practice, it's completely different. What's happening here?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Arnold is saying. When you look at it on the ground, of course, the fact that we have these policies doesn't always mean that there is implementation of those policies. SADC in particular is a region that's known for not free movement between countries. You've got South Africa, it's an economic strong point within the region, and there's a lot of movement coming in. And it's interesting because I think you can't stop people from migrating and you can't stop people from coming to your country, really. South Africa has one of the highest deportation rates in the world, but you know, we've seen progressive growing number of people coming in. So obviously deportation is not a solution either. And I think that one of the ways to address this is to paint a more positive narrative of what migrants can offer for economic growth, and also to find solutions, because there's no point trying to deter them. It's more beneficial for, you know, countries, for societies, for people to highlight the positive impact that migration can bring to a country.
Anele, let me just bring it back to you. Asmita here pointing out a fascinating stat, South Africa being one of the countries with the highest deportation rates. Wouldn't one argue that if at all you can register these workers, I don't want to call them migrants, workers, and maybe tax them, it would actually suit the South African economy and the fiscus as a whole, as opposed to deportation? What do you say to this notion?
It is indeed correct. The deportation part is quite expensive. It costs the taxpayers, and you deport the people today, tomorrow they are back in the country. So how does that help you? You know, in fact, when you deport 2, the next day you've got 5 or 10 coming in. So does that really work? No, it doesn't. It's not cost effective. It doesn't make any sense. But if the government can put in place systems where they can actually legalize every other migrant, then they will have a situation where everybody is contributing to the economy one way or the other in terms of working and being taxed and contributing in different manners. Some of them are business people. They come here, they just want to do business, and that's all. So
I love that you're saying some of them, because yes, often migrants are associated with all sorts of illicit activities. And what do you say to that notion?
Not necessarily, no. Most of these people coming from Zimbabwe and other countries are well educated. Given an opportunity, they will further their education number one. Number two, they will contribute effectively to the economy. They will obviously go into the employment space and feed into contributing towards the growth of the economy. Some of them are business-minded. They're business people. They're very innovative in their own right, in their own way. If you put them in the system, in the economic system, they will contribute quite effectively and heavily. But if you keep them outside, then you've got an outflow of certain capital, because some of the money doesn't come. Remember the circular flow model. It doesn't come into play. They send it back home through a bus. You never account for that money anymore. It's gone. It's history. But if systems are in place, they are legal, they are banking, they are within the system, the economic system, functioning in that part, then you know that whatever money, whether they're sending it to Zimbabwe or Malawi, whichever country, at the end of the day, it's within the system, it's taxed, and the country is able to recover some of the money there.
Asmita, just pick up on this particular one, this stereotype that being a migrant equals going on some illicit activities day and night. Isn't this being deterred by the fact that if you are actually an international student, it is way more expensive for you to pay for a university education as opposed to a domestic local here?
I mean, absolutely. I think we need to understand some of these stereotypes in relation to some of the social difficulties that local citizens tend to experience. So, you know, in South Africa, we've got very high unemployment rates. We've got, you know, a pressure on social benefits like access to schooling, healthcare, and so on. That's under a lot of pressure already. So there's also this misconception that if you have allowing more migrants, they're going to take your jobs, they're going to take your homes. And this is a common stereotype that's associated with migrants and with migration. But I mean, if you're looking at the Home Affairs' own data, it shows that a majority of migrants are actually quite self-reliant, and a lot of them also tend to work in the informal sector. So I think when we talk about economic migrants, we also need to differentiate between semi-skilled migrants and professional, what we would call white-collar workers. And there's a big distinction to be made between those two, because the SADC region notoriously also has a lot of movement of semi-skilled migrants, which has also fueled this perception that migrants are going to come, they're going to take your jobs, and so on. The sentiment isn't always the same when you're talking about lawyers or doctors or engineers or those kinds of professionals that enter your country. No one has a problem with accepting doctors from a neighboring country. Everyone's got a problem with accepting agricultural workers from a neighboring country. So I think that is an important distinction that needs to be made. And I think this idea of migrants coming, they take our jobs, this is part of a global discourse towards migrants. You only have to look at Trump's electoral campaign about building a wall on the Mexican border to see that this is not something that is that doesn't only affect South Africa, this type of discourse. It can actually be found throughout the world.
Anele, let me bring you back here. But we cannot touch this. We cannot talk about migration without addressing the issue of where you're migrating to and what the unemployment or employment figures are for that instance. Unemployment figures just coming through the other day, close to what, 27% in South Africa. Youth unemployment a few months ago, looking at 65%. Those are baffling figures by any standard. And if I am the Interior Minister, I'm going to think, you know what are you going to do when you come here? We have enough problems as it is. How to address that problem in the country that you're going to start with?
Basically, you see, this is where synergy comes in. First of all, I don't know why Africans are talking, or South Africans are talking separately from every other African country. I think we should be united in a way. You know, migration is a global phenomenon, and that's number one. Number two, governments themselves, they have to find a way or a system to accommodate that, because it is never going to stop. Now, you're asking me a question of the unemployment figures and all that stuff. Imagine if you take one Zimbabwean, for example, and take one South African, and say, you guys, we are going to fund you. I'm talking about now everybody coming into play, the private sector, the public sector, the government, everybody thinking, okay? Everybody applying their minds to this problem. What is the solution? Not deportation and all that. What is the solution that can work for people without infringing on the human rights of people? Take one Zimbabwean, take one South African and say, from Zimbabwe, what can we get? You speak to your counterparts. I mean, this is Africa, for Pete's sake. So these people can be able to communicate. What opportunities do you have for our young people? What can they do in your country, if that is the case? And if the government of Zimbabwe says, no, it's fine, this is what we can provide. If we can provide funding, these guys can go into agriculture, they can go into mining, they can go into this. I think synergy is one of the most effective ways of fixing this problem of migration and also creating a system where people can keep working, not only focusing on South Africa, but also focusing on getting South Africans into the other African spaces where there are opportunities and getting funding out of South Africa into those particular spaces. Otherwise, this problem is going to stay and it's not going to go away. So to solve it in the long term, IDC, the banks, and everybody else have to look into a system where they say, one Malawian or one Zimbabwean, and say to the government of Zimbabwe, what do you have? We have got young people here, Zimbabweans, South Africans. We can provide funding. The banks, the private sector, everybody coming on board, the manufacturing sector and all that kind of stuff. I think that will solve the problem in the long run.
Let me just put a pause on that. Asmita, back to you. Let's talk some policy. Less than 2 years ago, the African passport was launched by then Africa Union chairperson, Ms. Nkosazana Zuma. And this on paper looks like a very good idea. But let's face it, it's only diplomats and presidents that have this African passport. Do you get the sense that this is a very good idea that's just about to collect a lot of dust on a cupboard somewhere?
I think the African passport should be seen in light of broader continental goals towards regional integration, towards greater continental integration. We've had the Continental Free Trade Agreement that was launched this year. And we also have to accept, and this is probably where the political will mandate for African governments in, that you cannot achieve deep integration from a trade economic perspective unless you actually have trade in services and the free movement of people and free movement of capital. And this becomes very important because how much and how deep our integration can really go is really dependent on how much movement people are able to achieve across borders, across different regions. So I think that the idea of a visa-free travel is perhaps for now might seem like a lofty ideal, but I think if African countries and governments are serious about deeper integration and deeper economic ties.
You were just about to pick up on this particular one. The African passport, it looks like a good initiative. I mean, if we're to look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, GDP-wise, 2.2 trillion, the population close to 1.2 billion people by 2030. This is a good initiative, but how do we fast-track it and take it away from paper to actually action?
That is the problem. The procrastination or the lethargy that we see, the apathy that we see within the African Union itself. You know, one would wonder what they are really doing, because they've been speaking about this passport for I don't know how many years now. And all of a sudden it was launched. It's only for the select few. With the ordinary African can't access that particular passport. They've been speaking about One Africa. How long have you heard that particular topic?
Or AU.
It's Organization of African Union. You know, all these organizations have been coming and speaking big about uniting Africa. But do we see it happening in real life? Do we see it? Do we see the practicality of it? No. What we see is these challenges that we're talking about. To be honest with you, I get disturbed when somebody says, let's talk about xenophobia, because that should be a thing of the history. It's a colonial thing. Why are we still carrying on with those colonial burdens that happened a long time ago? Why can't we work on that particular journey as quickly as possible? You know what? The African Union leadership should really sit back and do an introspection on what really they have done to change a general African person's life. Because from where I'm sitting, they haven't done much. Now, we're talking about visa, we are talking about this migration challenge. If Africa was to create systems where people can travel from one particular country to another without any issues, open your business, you run your business, or get employment and all that kind of stuff, we wouldn't be discussing deportation, we wouldn't be discussing challenges on employment. But also, I'd like to say that I think the embassies have got a big role to play. The foreign affairs, those particular departments have got a big role to play in terms of uniting Africa than just waiting for the African Union. Because as I said earlier, if young people are given a chance to work together, to synergize. That's where the world is going to, by the way, whether we like it or not. We are getting into that space where a young person will move here and go to the United States and start something. Look at the Mexicans in the United States. They get there, they start businesses, they're contributing to the economy effectively. They are legalized. Barack Obama worked very hard. to make sure that all the migrants were legalized, they got their green card, because they saw that they were contributing to the economy. Now, talk about South Africa in general, the infrastructure. If you get into the infrastructure sector, the engineers, all the experts, they are all from other African countries. They are not from South Africa, most of them. Is there anything wrong with that? No, there is nothing wrong. But instead, there is exchange of skills and knowledge and everything else. So if you give all these people a chance to work together, and forget that you are from South Africa, you are from wherever, but you give all these people a chance to work together, provide funding for them, throw them in Zimbabwe, throw them in Zambia, throw them in Malawi. With funding, though, you will see a big change.
Anele and Asmita, many thanks for making time to speak to us. Of course, my guests, that is. Do join us again for more Capital Connection on Monday at 6:30 p.m. Central African time. For me, have a good night.